Inflammation is the first symptom or the first important element that disrupts the delicate balance of intestinal homeostasis. I have placed these three photos that represent the three fundamental pillars that support intestinal homeostasis, and the central pillar, of course, is that of the microbiota. Next is the mucus layer. The mucus layer that lines the intestinal epithelium houses the microbiota and everything that lives stably in the intestine, protecting the intestinal epithelium and having a metabolic and modulatory function regarding inflammation, which is somewhat what we will discuss today, very important. And the third pillar would be the intestinal epithelium itself, the functionality of the intestinal epithelium, how immunomodulation, immune response, and the phenomena of antigenic tolerance are, which we will now explain, as well as intestinal permeability. These would be the three main pillars whose delicate balance maintains intestinal homeostasis and determines the pro or anti-inflammatory state, depending on how each of them is. The performance of these pillars determines the proper functionality of the intestine. Here, I don't want to talk about the functionality of the microbiota because it is really the overall performance of the functionality of the intestine from which we obtain digestive function, normal digestion of nutrients, metabolic function, the performance of metabolite production, and the defensive immune function, everything. It is the first barrier of containment or response against toxins, antigens, and pathogens, the most important. And the neuroendocrine system as a major producer of metabolites, short-chain fatty acids, neurotransmitters, and many substances that determine neuroendocrine functional stability. In the context of inflammation, we are going to discuss the anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory determinants specifically dependent on the microbiota. The microbiota, let's be clear, is a much larger world than just bacteria, which, although quantitatively are the most numerous, also includes fungi, yeasts, viruses, and phages. Phages are the viruses that infect bacteria, protozoa, and archaea. The most important quantity of microorganisms is clearly bacteria, followed by archaea, fungi, yeasts, protozoa, and viruses and phages. But what we have the most clearly are bacteria. If we want to perform massive sequencing of the microbiota to quantify the bacteria by name, we find that the number one bacterium quantitatively in the intestine is Bacteroides. And next comes Faecalibacterium as number 2 and Bifidobacterium as number 3. Why do I put this slide here? Because when we talk about the metabolic performance of the microbiota in the context of anti-inflammation and modulation of inflammation, these two bacteria, Faecalibacterium and Bifidobacterium, are great producers of short-chain fatty acids, mainly butyrate, which is the major modulator of this inflammatory response at the intestinal level. Regarding the composition of the intestinal microbiota, it varies throughout life, but not by much. Here we know that this is not the case. This here says practically sterile. Now we know that this is not the case. We have microorganisms, especially lactobacillus, in the placenta, in amniotic fluid, even intrauterine. Of course, coming from the mother, mainly from her vaginal microbiota. And interestingly, there is a beautiful line of research on the oral microbiota from the mother's mouth, which determines that first intrauterine colonization. The moment of birth determines the process of microbiota implantation with two absolutely decisive events, which are the type of delivery and the type of breastfeeding. That is what will determine the pattern we have from 3 to 5 years old, until it is never stated here, starting from 55 to 60 years old, when the microbiota pattern physiologically changes, even without pathology. However, we have a wide range from 3 to 5 years old to 55 to 60, a long life, in which the microbiota, if we take care of it, is stable and its metabolic performance contributes to our health. We return again to the topic of inflammation. Why does the intestine dominate the world of inflammation? Here, when I talk about inflammation, I am not referring solely to intestinal inflammation. I am referring, of course, to intestinal inflammation, but also to systemic inflammation. And why does the intestine determine inflammation in other organs and tissues? Because the mucosal immune system, which comprises all the mucous membranes of the body, is functionally a single organ, even though they are anatomically separated. They are functionally a single organ called the mucosal immune system, who commands the master tissue or the regulatory tissue. That mucosa, which is the general captain in that action or good action of the immune and mucosal system, is the intestine. Why? Because it is the most extensive, it is the largest surface of contact between the inside and the outside, which means it is the surface where the most immune reactions occur, for better or for worse. Those immune reactions absolutely depend on how our microbiota is. Alessio Fasano, who is one of the most important researchers in the context of intestinal permeability, because he is the one who discovered zonulin, has many publications in the context of intestinal permeability. And he makes a publication, he has several conferences on YouTube, and repeats over and over that we are not born predestined to suffer from chronic inflammatory diseases. The genetic load with which we are born is not even the determinant. That genetic load, we are born with it, is like our piano, but it is the microbiota that is the interpreter who sits down to play that piano. And if it knows how to play the piano, health comes out of that piano, beautiful music comes out. If it produces a disastrous sound, that would be the disease. Thus, indeed, in the context of inflammation, the epigenetic determinant, whatever our genetic load may be, the epigenetic determinant that initiates and triggers inflammatory phenomena is, in fact, our microbiota.